I currently don't have a project open. And the reason is I like to work through the process now of opening up the Revit file when it's already had work sharing enabled. To begin this process, we need to first come up here to the word Open underneath Projects, and then with Open selected, highlight on the word Central Model. The central model is the main file that's out on the network, and then everybody at their computers are saving back to the central model. And the central model is then updating with the latest information and then feeding that information back to each of our computers. It's important, in fact, it's vital that we never work inside of the central model. If you make a change inside the central model or are working in the central model, not only will people not be able to save back to it, but they're going to lose all of their work since their last save. So never work in the central model. It's just sort of there so that everybody can save to it, not to actually make adjustments inside of it. With this highlighted, verify that Create New Local has a check mark. By default, it should. In fact, it almost always has a check mark in it. But if it's ever cleared out, that means at that point, you'd be working in the central model if you should click Open. And you do not want to do that. So click a check mark there, make sure that Create New Local is available, and then select on the word Open. If it asks you, do you want to create a new local file? Do you want to overwrite the existing one or append a timestamp? In my case, it's because I've actually been in here once before, and it's asking me this question. I usually say I want to overwrite the existing local file. Up here at the top of the screen, it's not just going to say Central Model, but it's going to say Central Model and then your name. And the reason is it creates what's called a new local file on your computer. In fact, that's what that last dialog box that I just got said. Do you want to overwrite that file? And since I'd already done this once, I told it yes. Now, the local file is the file that you do most of your work on. You're working directly from your computer, making changes to the model. And then when you save, which is called saving it back to Central, it will then update the information of the changes that you've made in that central file that's located on the network. Then it'll also download any changes from other people that have been uploaded to the central model back down to your computer. So the file on your computer, every time you save, will update the file on the server. Also, every time the file on the server gets updated with your information, you'll also download the latest information with the changes everybody else has made. Right now, I'm looking at Workset 1 and it says not editable. If I click on the icon down here for worksets, we can see that the reason why it says not editable is because it has no next to editable here. Now, we could say yes to this, which would mean that we would be the only people that could work inside of this workset. If you're the structural engineer, you might say that, yes, I'm the one that has ownership of the structural workset. Yes. And then you would be the person that has ownership of the structural workset. And nobody else would be able to make changes to that structural workset until you change this back to no again. So worksets on this level could control who has ownership or who can make changes to what items in the project. In this case, though, I don't really want to have this be yes. I'm just going to switch it back to no. And I'm going to click on OK to this. The next thing I want to show is if we zoom in here, we can see that everything is pretty much the same color. Now, what we can do is click back on this Worksets dialog again, and then change this box to have a check mark in it. And this is going to gray anything that's on an inactive workset. If we click on OK to that, what this means is that anything that was on Workset 1 is going to have its normal presentation look. But such things as the structural grids, which happen to be on the Shared Levels and Grids workset, are grayed out because we checkmarked the box that said gray out anything that's not on this workset. By doing this, it makes it a little bit easier for us to see what's currently on the workset we're working in and which items that we have ownership of, so we know which items we can easily make changes to without switching to a different workset. Now, the next thing we need to do is click on where it has the Shared Levels and Grids here on this menu. By doing this, we can see just those things are on the Shared Levels and Grids being nice and dark, while the things that are on the other workset are now grayed out. So we can begin to control and visualize which things are on which workset by graying things in and out. Not only does having worksets give us control over things, It also helps us with the visibility and what we can turn on and off as far as the visibility on the screen. Now we're going to take a look at that in just a moment, but there's one other thing I want to show first. And that is where we have the shared levels and grids, there's this little down arrow here. And I'm going to turn this back to work set 1. Because what I want to do is draw in something else and have it be put right into this area. So I'm going to do this wall architectural here. I'm not going to have it be a curtain wall. I'm just going to keep it really easy and generic. The generic 200 millimeter wall. The exact location doesn't matter. Draw it in. And then I'm going to hit the escape key a couple times on the keyboard. It just drew this in on this work set. In fact, if we select on this item, we can now scroll down and we can see which work set it is that this item has been drawn on. We can even see who the person was. In this case, it's me. And I'm just going to click off here out in the space so I can get out of the command. If I change this to be a different work set, we'll see that this wall now turns gray. For instance, if I click this to be structural instead, we can see the wall's gray because it's now been drawn on that different work set. In this case, I'm going to change this back to being work set 1 because that's where most things are drawn at. And then over here underneath properties, there's this option called visibility graphics overrides. If we click the edit button next to it, we can see that one of the tabs is called work sets. And if we wanted to shut off anything that was not on this work set, we could do that. I know that shared levels and grids has these objects on them, the structural grids. So those things are going to go away if we shut the visibility of them off. So by clicking over here and telling it to hide those entities, and then clicking on apply, we can now see that it's applied that setting and anything that was drawn on this work set is now hidden. We can no longer see it anymore. So work sets, one functionality is that it allows just certain people to be able to work on certain things. The other functionality is that it allows us to hide things universally. And that anything that we draw on that work set will then become part of that work set. So if we want to hide it, do whatever we need to with it, we can then control the visibility graphics of those objects that way. This is really the closest thing that Revit has to the AutoCAD thing, which is known as layers. Except they're different layers that you can take ownership of. And if you're working on that layer, you can lock other people out from being able to work on that layer while you're working on it. You can also have multiple people working in a work set at the same time. But if you do that, only one person can work on one object at that time. An example of that would be this. If I click on OK to this, and now I select back on this wall that I just drew. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the little flip icon here. We're barely going to see any change at all, but it has made a change to the Revit model. Now that I've done that, I am considered the owner of this object. What this means is that nobody else can now make a modification to this object until I save back to Central. There's an option here that says Synchronize and Modify Settings. Now usually I go to the next option, which is this down arrow here, and choose Synchronize Now. This is like saving it directly to the central file. But Synchronize and Modify Settings, this will show us all those settings that will automatically save if we would click that other button. In this case, we can see that it keeps track of where the central model is located at. We can add any comments that we want. It also says that after synchronizing, relinquish the following work sets and elements. And right now we have a borrowed element, and that's that wall. What this means is that now if we click on OK to this, it's going to synchronize back to the central file, back to that network location, the file called central model. And by doing that, we've now given up control of this entity, which means that the other person who might be working on the project could now make modifications to it. So work sets can be used to control who has control over which things in Revit. Work sets also allow us to affect the visibility of those things that we can see in our individual views. And finally, the whole work set process allows us to have a local file, and that's exactly what it's called, the local file, on your computer. You do all your work on it, and then you save back to the central model. And then during that process of saving back, you'll download whatever the latest changes are from whoever has made the latest changes back into your model. And then at that point, you'll be working on the latest and greatest Revit model.